ZF Micro Solutions Inc. versus TAT Capital Partners Ltd. May it please the Court. Good afternoon, Your Honors. My name is Zachary Saylor, and I represent the appellee TAT Capital Partners Ltd. I respectfully ask this Court to affirm the judgment of the trial court because the Court correctly determined that this case was equitable in nature and therefore did not require a jury trial. At its core, this appeal presents a narrow but important question: whether a plaintiff may transform an otherwise equitable breach of fiduciary duty claim into a legal claim simply by requesting monetary damages. The trial court correctly answered that question in the negative, and its judgment should be affirmed. The issue before this court is whether the plaintiff's breach of fiduciary duty claim should have been tried before a jury solely because the plaintiff requested compensatory damages. We submit that under long-standing California law and centuries of equitable tradition, the answer is no. For centuries, breach of fiduciary duty claims have been recognized as fundamentally equitable in nature. Fiduciary relationships arise in contexts such as corporate governance, trusted relationships, and certain agency relationships where one party is entrusted to act in the best interests of another. Because of this special relationship of trust and confidence, courts have historically enforced fiduciary obligations through equitable principles, focusing on fairness, loyalty, and good faith rather than just purely legal remedies. The trial court properly recognized this historical foundation. It correctly focused on the nature of the claim itself, not the remedy sought, to determine the right to a jury trial attached. The approach is consistent with California law and with the constitutional distinction between legal and equitable causes of action. The California Constitution preserves the right to a jury trial only for legal actions as they existed at a common law level at the time that the Constitution was adopted. It does not extend to the right to equitable proceedings. Courts have consistently applied this distinction by looking at the substance of the action rather than the form of relief requested. Simply requesting money damages does not automatically convert an equitable claim into a legal one. In this case, ZF Micro Solutions alleged that TAT Capital Partners breached fiduciary duties arising from its position on the company's board of directors. Those duties exist solely because of the fiduciary relationship between the parties. Without that relationship, and without the trust and confidence placed in the corporate director, there would be no cause of action at all. This is the defining feature of an equitable claim. It arises from a relationship of trust and is governed by principle of fairness and fiduciary responsibility. The plaintiff attempts to characterize this case as an ordinary tort action simply because it seeks compensatory damages. However, that argument misapprehends the nature of fiduciary duty law. The remedy requested should not control the classification of the claim, and if it did, then virtually every fiduciary duty case would be recast as legal action simply by adding a damages request. That would effectively erase the long-standing distinction between law and between equity. California courts have repeatedly rejected this approach. Instead, they examine the gravamen of the claim. Here, the gravamen is not negligence in the action or the generalized tort, but alleged violations of fiduciary obligations by a corporate director, obligations that exist only in equity and are enforced through the equity principles. The trial court properly recognized the fiduciary duty claim require court to evaluate standards such as loyalty, honesty, good faith, and fair dealing. These are not rigid legal standards designed for jury determination. Rather, they require a contextual, fact-intensive assessment of business conduct, corporate relationships, and equitable fairness. Historically, these determinations have been entrusted to judges sitting in equity, not juries. The plaintiff's reliance on Article 1, Section 16 of the California Constitution is misplaced. The provision guarantees the right to a jury trial only in actions where such a right existed at common law. It does not expand to the right beyond its historical boundaries. The equitable claims, by definition, fall outside that constitutional guarantee. The plaintiff places significant emphasis on its request for monetary damages, alleging that this alone should trigger a jury trial. However, California courts have long rejected such a bright-line rule. The nature of the remedy is only one factor, and it is not dispositive. Courts instead look to the primary right asserted in the historical nature of the claim. Here, the primary right at issue is the duty of loyalty owed by a corporate fiduciary, a quintessentially equitable obligation. If the courts were to adopt the plaintiff's position, it would create significant instability in corporate litigation. Any plaintiff asserting breach of fiduciary claims could demand a jury trial simply by requesting damages, even though the underlying claim arises from equity. That would disrupt over a century of jurisprudence distinguishing between legal and equitable claims and would shift complex fiduciary disputes away from the judges who are better equipped to handle them rather than juries. The consequences of such a shift would be particularly significant in corporate governance disputes. Fiduciary duty cases often involve nuanced evaluations of business judgments, board decision-making, conflicts of interest, and the interplay of corporate stockholders. These are precisely the type of issues that courts of equity have historically resolved. Judges are trained to apply equitable doctrines consistently and to balance competing interests in a way that promotes fairness and predictability in corporate law. In contrast, juries, while they are essential in legal disputes, are not traditionally tasked with applying fiduciary standards rooted in equity. Preserving the distinction ensures fiduciary law remains coherent, predictable, and consistent with its historical foundation. It is important to emphasize that the trial court conducted a full and fair bench trial. The court heard witness testimony, they evaluated documentary evidence, and they made detailed factual findings. After carefully considering the record, the court concluded that TAT Capital Partners did not breach its fiduciary duties. The plaintiff has not demonstrated that this conclusion was based on legal error or an improper application of fiduciary principles. The plaintiff's appeal rests entirely on its disagreement with the forum in which the case was tried, but disagreement with the trial court's proceedings does not establish reversible error. The question before this court is not whether the plaintiff would have preferred a jury, but whether it had the constitutional right to one, and under well-established law, it did not. Reversal would therefore be inappropriate. It would undermine settled principles distinguishing legal and equitable claims and would invite further litigants to circumvent these principles through artful pleading. That would create uncertainty in fiduciary duty litigation and weaken the consistency of California corporate law. For all of these reasons, the trial court correctly determined that this case remained equitable in nature despite the plaintiff's request for compensatory damages. The denial of a jury trial was not legal error. The court properly exercised its authority in conducting a bench trial and issued findings based on equitable principles. Accordingly, TAT Capital Partners respectfully requests that this court affirm the judgment of the trial court. Thank you, Your Honors, and thank you for your time.